Chapter 17 of The Pirate's Own Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Pirate's Own Book by Charles Ellms. Chapter 17. Account of the Lynn Pirates and Thomas Veal, who was buried in his cave by the great earthquake. In the year 1658 there was a great earthquake in New England. Some time previous, on one pleasant evening, a little after sunset, a small vessel was seen to anchor near the mouth of Saugus River. A boat was presently lowered from her side, into which 4 men descended, and moved up the river a considerable distance when they landed, and proceeded directly into the woods. They had been noticed by only a few individuals, but in those early times, when the people were surrounded by danger, and easily susceptible of alarm, such an incident was well calculated to awaken suspicion, and in the course of the evening the intelligence was conveyed to many houses. In the morning the people naturally directed their eyes toward the shore, in search of the strange vessel, but she was gone, and no trace could be found either of her or her singular crew. It was afterwards ascertained that, on the morning, one of the men at the iron works, on going into the foundry, discovered a paper on which was written, that if a quantity of shackles, handcuffs, hatchets, and other articles of iron manufacture were made and deposited with secrecy in a certain place in the woods which was particularly designated, an amount of silver in their full value would be found in their place. The articles were made in a few days, and placed in conformity with all the directions. On the next morning they were gone, and the money was found according to the promise. But though a watch had been kept, no vessel was seen. Some months afterwards the 4 men returned, and selected one of the most secluded and romantic spots in the woods of Saugus for their abode. The place of their retreat was a deep, narrow valley, shut in on 2 sides by craggy, precipitous rocks, and shrouded on the others by thick pines, hemlocks, and cedars, between which there was only one small spot to which the rays of the sun at noon could penetrate. On climbing up the rude and almost perpendicular steps of the rock on either side, the eye could command a full view of the bay on the south, and a prospect of a considerable portion of the surrounding country. The place of their real retreat has ever since been called the Pirates' Glen, and they could not have selected a spot on the coast for many miles more favorable for the purposes both of concealment and observation. Even at this day, when the neighborhood has become thickly peopled, it is still a lonely and desolate place, and probably not 1 in 100 of the inhabitants has ever descended into its silent and gloomy recess. There the pirates built a small hut, made a garden, and dug a well, the appearance of which is still visible. It has been supposed that they buried money, but though people have dug there, and in many other places, none has ever been found. After residing there some time, their retreat became known, and one of the king's cruisers appeared on the coast. They were traced to their glen, and 3 of them were taken and carried to England, where it is probable they were executed. The other, whose name was Thomas Veal, escaped to a rock in the woods, about 2 miles to the north, in which was a spacious cavern, where the pirates had previously deposited some of their plunder. There the fugitive fixed his residence, and practiced the trade of a shoemaker, occasionally coming down to the village to obtain articles of sustenance. He continued his residence till the great earthquake in 1658, when the top of the rock was loosened, and crushed down into the mouth of the cavern, enclosing the unfortunate inmate in its unyielding prison. It has ever since been called the Pirates' Dungeon. A part of the cavern is still open, and is much visited by the curious. This rock is situated on a lofty range of thickly wooded hills, and commands an extensive view of the ocean, for 50 miles both north and south. A view from the top of it at once convinces the beholder that it would be impossible to select a place more convenient for the haunt of a gang of pirates, as all the vessels bound in and out of the harbors of Boston, Salem, and the adjacent ports can be distinctly seen from its summit. Saugus River meanders among the hills a short distance to the south, and its numerous creeks, which extend among thick bushes, would afford good places to secrete boats, until such time as the pirates descried a sail, when they could instantly row down the river, attack and plunder them, and with their booty return to the cavern. This was evidently their mode of procedure. On an open space in front of the rock are still to be seen distinct traces of a small garden spot, and in the corner is a small well, full of stones and rubbish. The foundation of the wall round the garden remains, and shows that the spot was of a triangular shape, and was well selected for the cultivation of potatoes and common vegetables. The aperture in the rock is only about 5 feet in height, and extends only 15 feet into the rock. The needle is strongly attracted around this, either by the presence of magnetic iron ore or some metallic substance buried in the interior. The Pirates' Glen, which is some distance from this, is one of nature's wildest and most picturesque spots, and the cellar of the pirates' hut remains to the present time, as does a clear space which was evidently cultivated at some remote period. Chapter 17.
Chapter 18 of the Pirate's Own Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Pirate's Own Book by Charles Ellms. Chapter 18. History of the Ladrone Pirates, and their depredations on the coast of China, with an account of the enterprises and victories of Mistress Cheng, a female pirate. The Ladrones, as they were christened by the Portuguese at Macao, were originally a disaffected set of Chinese that revolted against the oppression of the Mandarins. The first scene of their depredations was the western coast, about Cochin China, where they began by attacking small trading vessels in rowboats, carrying from 30 to 40 men each. They continued this system of piracy, and thrived and increased in numbers under it, for several years. At length, the fame of their success, and the oppression and horrid poverty and want that many of the lower orders of the Chinese labored under, had an effect of augmenting their bands with astonishing rapidity. Fishermen and other destitute classes flocked by hundreds to their standard, and their audacity growing with their numbers, they not merely swept the coast, but blockaded all the rivers and attacked and took several large government war junks, mounting from 10 to 15 guns each. These junks being added to their shoals of boats, the pirates formed a tremendous fleet, which was always along shore, so that no small vessel could safely trade on the coast. When they lacked prey on the sea, they laid the land under tribute. They were at first accustomed to go on shore and attack the maritime villages, but becoming bolder, like the buccaneers, made long inland journeys, and surprised and plundered even large towns. An energetic attempt made by the Chinese government to destroy them only increased their strength, for in their first encounter with the pirates, 28 of the imperial junks struck, and the remaining 12 saved themselves by a precipitate retreat. The captured junks, fully equipped for war, were a great acquisition to the robbers, whose numbers now increased more rapidly than ever. They were in their plenitude of power in the year 1809, when Mr. Glasspool had the misfortune to fall into their hands, at which time that gentleman supposed their force to consist of 70,000 men, navigating 800 large vessels and 1,000 small ones, including rowboats. They were divided into 6 large squadrons under different flags: the red, the yellow, the green, the blue, the black, and the white. These wasps of the oceans, as the Chinese historian called them, were further distinguished by the names of their respective commanders. By these commanders a certain Cheng Yu had been most distinguished by his valor and conduct. By degrees, Cheng obtained almost a supremacy of command over the whole united fleet, and so confident was this robber in his strength and daily augmenting means, that he aspired to the dignity of a king, and went so far as openly to declare his patriotic intention of of hurling the present Tartar family from the throne of China, and of restoring the ancient Chinese dynasty. But, unfortunately for the ambitious pirate, he perished in a heavy gale, and instead of placing a sovereign on the Chinese throne, he and his lofty aspirations were buried in the Yellow Sea. And now comes the most remarkable passage in the history of these pirates. Remarkable with any class of men, but doubly so among the Chinese, who entertain more than the general Oriental opinion of the inferiority of the fair sex. On the death of Ching Yih, his legitimate wife had sufficient influence over the freebooters to induce them to recognize her authority in the place of her deceased husband's, and she appointed one Pao as her lieutenant and prime minister, and provided that she should be considered the mistress or commander-in-chief of the united squadrons. This Pao had been a poor fisher-boy, picked up with his father at sea while fishing by Ching Yih, whose goodwill and favor he had fortune to captivate, and by whom, before that pirate's death, he had been made a captain. Instead of declining under the rule of a woman, the pirates became more enterprising than ever. Cheng's widow was clever as well as brave, and so was her lieutenant Pao. Between them they drew up a code of law for the better regulation of the freebooters. In this it was decreed that if any man went privately on shore, or did what they call transgressing the bars, he should have his ears slit in the presence of the whole fleet. A repetition of the same unlawful act was death. No one article, however trifling in value, was to be privately subtracted from the booty or plundered goods. Everything they took was regularly entered on the register of their stores. The following clause of Mistress Cheng's code is still more delicate. No person shall debauch at his pleasure captive women, taken in the villages and open places, and brought on board ship. He must first request the ship's purser for permission, and then go aside in the ship's hold. To use violence against any woman, or to wed her without permission, shall be punished with death. By these means an admirable discipline was maintained on board the ships, and the peasantry on shore never let the pirates want for gunpowder, provisions, or any other necessity. On a piratical expedition, either to advance or retreat without orders was a capital offence. Under these philosophical institutions, and the guidance of a woman, the robbers continued to scour the China Sea, plundering every vessel they came near. The great war mandarin, Lynn, sailed from the Boca Tigris into the sea to fight the pirates. Pao gave him a tremendous drubbing, and gained a splendid victory. In this battle, which lasted from morning to night, the mandarin Lynn, a desperate fellow himself, leveled a gun at Pao, who fell on the deck as the piece went off, his disheartened crew concluding it was all over with him. But Pao was quick-eyed. He had seen the unfriendly intention of the mandarin, and thrown himself down. The great mandarin was soon after taken with 15 junks. 3 were sunk. The pirate lieutenant would have dealt mercifully with him, but the fierce old man suddenly seized him by the hair on the crown of his head, and grinned at him so that he might provoke him to slay him. But even then Powell spoke kindly to him. Upon this he committed suicide, being 70 years of age. After several victories and reverses, the Chinese historian says our men of war, escorting some merchant ships, happened to meet the pirate chief nicknamed the Jewel of the Crew, cruising at sea. The traders became exceedingly frightened, but our commander said, "This not being the flag of our widow Cheng Yi, we are a match for them. Therefore we will attack and conquer them." Then ensued a battle. They attacked each other with guns and stones, and many people were killed and wounded. The fighting ceased towards evening, and began again next morning. The pirates and the men of war were very close to each other, and they boasted mutually about their strength and valor. The traders remained at some distance. They saw the pirates mixing gunpowder in their beverage. They looked instantly red about the face and the eyes, and then fought desperately. This fighting continued 3 days and nights incessantly. At last, becoming tired on both sides, they separated. To understand this inglorious bulletin, the reader must remember that many of the combatants only handled bows and arrows, and pelted stones, and that Chinese powder and guns are both exceedingly bad. The pathos of the conclusion does somewhat remind one of the Irishman's dispatch during the American War. It was a bloody battle while it lasted, and the sergeant of marines lost his cartouche box. The Admiral Ting River was sent to sea against them. This man was surprised at anchor by the ever vigilant Paou, to whom many fishermen and other people on the coast must have acted as friendly spies. Seeing escape impossible, and that his officers stood pale and inactive by the flagstaff, the Admiral conjured them, by their fathers and mothers, their wives and children, and by the hopes and brilliant reward if they succeeded, and of vengeance if they perished, to do their duty, and the combat began. The Admiral had the good fortune at the onset of killing with one of his great guns the pirate captain, the jewel of the crew. But the robbers swarmed thicker and thicker around him, and when the dreaded Paou lay him by the board, without help or hope, the Mandarin killed himself. An immense number of his men perished in the sea, and 25 vessels were lost. After his defeat, it was resolved by the Chinese government to cut off all their supplies of food and starve them out. All vessels that were in port were ordered to remain there, and those at sea or on the coast ordered to return with all speed. But the pirates, full of confidence, now resolved to attack the harbors themselves, and to ascend the rivers which are navigable for many miles up country, and rob the villages. The consternation was great when the Chinese saw them venturing above the government forts. The pirates separated, Mistress Cheng plundering in one place, Paou in another, and O po Tai in another. It was at this time that Mr. Glasspool had the ill fortune to fall into their power. This gentleman, then an officer in the East India Company's ship, the Marquis of Ely, which was anchored under an island about 12 miles from Macao, was ordered to proceed to the latter place with a boat to procure a pilot. He left the ship in one of the cutters with 7 British seamen well armed on the 17th of September, 1809. He reached Macao in safety, and having done his business there and procured a pilot, returned towards the ship the following day. But unfortunately the ship had weighed anchor and was under sail, and in consequence of squally weather accompanied with thick fogs, the boat could not reach her, and Mr. Glasspool and his men and the pilot were left at sea in an open boat. Our situation, says that gentleman, was truly distressing, night closing fast, with a threatening appearance, blowing fresh, with a hard rain and a heavy sea. Our boat very leaky, without a compass, anchor, or provisions, and drifting fast on a lee shore, surrounded with dangerous rocks, and inhabited by the most barbarous pirates. After suffering dreadfully for 3 whole days, Mr. Glasspool, by the advice of the pilot, made for a narrow channel, where he presently discovered 3 large boats at anchor, which, on seeing the English boat, weighed and made sail towards it. The pilot told Mr. Glasspool they were Ladrones, and that if they captured the boat they would certainly put them all to death. After rowing tremendously for 6 hours they escaped these boats, but on the following morning, falling in with the large fleet of the pirates, which the English mistook for fishing boats, they were captured. About 20 savage-looking villains, said Mr. Glasspool, who were stowed at the bottom of the boat, leapt on board us. They were armed with short swords in either hand, one of which they laid upon our necks, and pointed the other to our breasts, keeping their eyes fixed on the officer, waiting his signal to cut or desist. Seeing we were incapable of making any resistance, the officer sheathed his sword, and the other immediately followed his example. They then dragged us into their boat, and carried us on board one of their junks, with the most savage demonstrations of joy, and, as we supposed, to torture us and put us to a cruel death. When on board the junk, they rifled the Englishmen, and brought heavy chains to chain them to the deck. At this time a boat came and took me, with one of my men and an interpreter, on board the chief's vessel. I was then taken before the chief. He was seated on deck in a large chair, dressed in purple silk with a black turban on. He appeared to be about 30 years of age, a stout, commanding-looking man. He took me by the coat and drew me close to him, then questioned the interpreter very strictly, asking who we were and what was our business in that part of the country. I told him to say we were Englishmen in distress, having been 4 days at sea without provision. This he would not credit, but said we were bad men, and that he would put us all to death, and then ordered some men to put the interpreter to the torture until he confessed the truth. Upon this occasion, a Ladrone, who had been once to England and spoke a few words of English, came to the chief and told him we were really Englishmen, that we had plenty of money, adding that the buttons on my coat were gold. The chief then ordered us some coarse brown rice, of which we made a tolerable meal, having eaten nothing for nearly 4 days, except a few green oranges. During our repast, a number of Ladrones crowded round us, examining our clothes and hair, and giving us every possible annoyance. Several of them brought swords and laid them on our necks, making signs that they would soon take us on shore and cut us in pieces, which I am sorry to say was the fate of some hundreds during my captivity. I was now summoned before the chief, who had been conversing with the interpreter. He said I must write to my captain, and tell him, if he did not send $100,000 for our ransom in 10 days, he would put us all to death. After vainly expostulating to lessen the ransom, Mr. Glasspool wrote the letter, and a small boat came alongside it and took it to Macao. Early in the night, the fleet sailed, and anchored about 1 o'clock the following day in a bay under the island of Lantau, where the head admiral of the Ladrones, our acquaintance Pow, was lying at anchor, with about 200 vessels and a Portuguese brig they had captured a few days before, and the captain and part of the crew of which they had murdered. Early the next morning, a fishing boat came to inquire if they had captured a European boat. They came to the vessel the English were in. One of the boatmen spoke a few words of English, and told me that he had a Ladrone pass, and was sent by our captain in search of us. I was rather surprised to find he had no letter. He appeared to be well acquainted with the chief, and remained in the cabin smoking opium, and playing cards all the day. In the evening I was summoned with the interpreter before the chief. He questioned us in much milder tone, saying he now believed we were Englishmen, a people he wished to be friendly with, and that if our captain would lend him $70,000 till he returned from his cruise up the river, he would repay him, and send us all to Macao. I assured him it was useless writing on these terms, and unless our ransom was speedily settled, the English fleet would sail, and render our enlargement altogether ineffectual. He remained determined, and said if it were not sent, he would keep us, and make us fight, or put us to death. I accordingly wrote, and gave my letter to the man belonging to the boat before mentioned. He said he could not return with an answer in less than 5 days. The chief now gave me the letter I wrote when first taken. I have never been able to ascertain his reasons for detaining it, but supposed he dared not negotiate for our ransom without orders from the head admiral, who I understood was sorry at our being captured. He said the English ships would join the Mandarins and attack them. While the fleet lay here, one night the Portuguese who were left in the captured brig murdered the Ladrones that were on board of her, cut the cables, and fortunately escaped through the darkness of the night. At daylight the next morning, the fleet, amounting to about 500 sail of different sizes, weighed to proceed on their intended cruise up the rivers, to levy contributions on the towns and villages. It is impossible to describe what my feelings at this critical time, having received no answer to my letters, and the fleet under way to sail, hundreds of miles up a country never visited by Europeans, there to remain probably for many months, which would render all opportunities for negotiating our enlargement totally ineffectual, as the only method of communication is by boats that have to pass from the Ladrones, and they dare not venture above 20 miles from Macao, being obliged to come and go in the night to avoid the Mandarins. And if these boats should be detected in having any intercourse with the Ladrones, they are immediately put to death, and all their relations, though they had not joined in the crime, share in the punishment, in order that not a single person of their families should be left to imitate the crimes or avenge their death. The following is a very touching incident in Mr. Glasspool's narrative. Wednesday, the 26th of September, at daylight, we passed in sight of our own ships at anchor under the island of Chung Po. The chief then called me, pointing to the ships, and told the interpreter to tell us to look at them, for we should never see them again. About noon we entered a river to the westward of the bog. 3 or 4 miles from the entrance, we passed a large town situated on the side of a beautiful hill, which is tributary to the Ladrones. The inhabitants saluted them with songs as they passed. After committing numerous minor robberies, the Ladrones now prepared to attack a town with a formidable force, collected in rowboats from the different vessels. They sent a messenger to the town demanding a tribute of $10,000 annually, saying, if these terms were not complied with, they would land, destroy the town, and murder all the inhabitants, which they certainly would have done, had the town laid in a more advantageous situation for their purpose, and, being placed out of reach of their shot, they allowed them to come to terms. The inhabitants agreed to pay $6,000, which they were to collect by the time of our return down the river. This finesse had the desired effect, for during our absence they mounted a few guns on a hill, which commanded the passage, and gave us in lieu of the dollars a warm salute on our return. October the 1st, the fleet weighed in the night, dropped by the tide up the river, and anchored very quietly before a town surrounded by a thick wood. Early in the morning the Ladrones assembled in rowboats and landed. They gave a shout, and rushed into the town, sword in hand. The inhabitants fled to the adjacent hills in numbers apparently superior to the Ladrones. We may easily imagine to ourselves the horror with which these miserable people must be seized, on being obliged to leave their homes and everything dear to them. It was a most melancholy sight to see women in tears, clasping their infants in their arms, and imploring mercy for them from those brutal robbers. The old and the sick, who were unable to fly or make resistance, were either made prisoners or most inhumanely butchered. The boats continued passing and repassing from the junks to the shore, in quick succession, laden with booty, and the men besmeared with blood. 250 women and several children were made prisoners, and sent on board different vessels. They were unable to escape with the men, owing to that abominable practice of cramping their feet. Several of them were not able to move without assistance. In fact, they might all be said to totter rather than to walk. 20 of these poor women were sent on board the vessel I was in. They were hauled on board by the hair, and treated in a most savage manner. When the chief came on board, he questioned them respecting the circumstances of their friends, and demanded ransoms accordingly, from $6,000 to $600 each. He ordered them a berth on deck, at the after part of the vessel, where they had nothing to shelter them from the weather, which at this time was very variable, the days excessively hot, and the nights cold with heavy rains. The town being plundered of everything valuable, it was set on fire, and reduced to ashes by the morning. The fleet remained here 3 days, negotiating for the ransom of the prisoners, and plundering the fish tanks and gardens. During all this time the Chinese never ventured from the hills, though they were frequently not more than 100 Ladrones on shore at a time, and I am sure the people on the hills exceeded 10 times that number. On the 10th we formed a junction with the Black Squadron, and proceeding many miles up a wide and beautiful river, passing several ruins of villages that had been destroyed by the Black Squadron, on the 17th the fleet anchored abreast 4 mud batteries, which defended a town, so entirely surrounded with wood that it was impossible to form any idea of its size. The weather was very hazy, with hard squalls of rain. The Ladrones remained perfectly quiet for 2 days. On the 3rd day the forts commenced a brisk fire for several hours. The Ladrones did not return a single shot, but weighed in the night and dropped down the river. The reasons they gave for not attacking the town or returning the fire were that Joss had not promised them success. They are very superstitious, and consult their idol on all occasions. If his omens are good, they will undertake the most daring enterprises. The fleet now anchored opposite the ruins of the town, where the women had been made prisoners. Here we remained 5 or 6 days, during which time about 100 of the women were ransomed. The remainder were offered for sale among the Ladrones for $40 each. The woman is considered the lawful wife of the purchaser, who would be put to death if he discarded her. Several of them leapt overboard and drowned themselves, rather than submit to such infamous degradation. Mai Ying, the wife of Ki Chu Yang, was very beautiful, and a pirate being about to seize her by the head, she abused him exceedingly. The pirate bound her to the yardarm, but on abusing him yet more, the pirate dragged her down and broke two of her teeth, which filled her mouth and jaws with blood. The pirate sprang up again to bind her. Ying allowed him to approach, but as soon as he came nearer her, she laid hold of his garments with her bleeding mouth, and threw both him and herself into the river, where they were both drowned. The remaining captives of both sexes were, after some months, liberated, on having paid a ransom of 15,000 liang, or ounces of silver. The fleet then weighed, continues Mr. Glasspoole, and made sail down the river to receive the ransom from the town before mentioned. As we passed the hill, they fired several shots at us, but without effect. The Ladrones were much exasperated, and determined to revenge themselves. They dropped out of reach of their shot, and anchored. Every junk sent about 100 men each on shore, to cut paddy and destroy their orange groves, which were most effectually performed for several miles down the river. During our stay here, they received information of 9 boats lying up a creek, laden with paddy. Boats were immediately dispatched after them. Next morning these boats were brought to the fleet. 10 or 12 men were taken in them. As these had made no resistance, the chief said he would allow them to become Ladrones, if they agreed to take the usual oaths before Joss. 3 or 4 of them refused to comply, for which they were punished in the following cruel manner. Their hands were tied behind their back, a rope from the masthead rove through their arms, and hoisted 3 or 4 feet from the deck, and 5 or 6 men flogged them with their rattans, twisted together till they were apparently dead, then hoisted them up to the masthead, and left them hanging nearly an hour, then lowered them down, and repeated the punishment till they died or complied with the oath. On the 28th of October, I received a letter from Captain K, brought by a fisherman who had told him he would give us all back for $3,000. He advised me to offer 3,000, and if not accepted, extend it to 4, but not further, as it was bad policy to offer much at first. At the same time, assuring me we should be liberated, let the ransom be what it would. I offered the chief the 3,000, which he disdainfully refused, saying it was not to be played with, and unless they sent $10,000 and 2 large guns with several casks of gunpowder, he would soon put us to death. I wrote to Captain K, and informed him of the chief's determination, requesting, if an opportunity offered, to send us a shift of clothes, for which it may be easily imagined we were much distressed, having been 7 weeks without a shift, although constantly exposed to the weather, and of course frequently wet. On the 1st of November, the fleet sailed up a narrow river, and anchored at night within 2 miles of a town called Little Whampoa. In front of it was a small fort, and several Mandarin vessels lying in the harbor. The chief sent the interpreter to me, saying, I must order my men to make cartridges and clean their muskets, ready to go on shore in the morning. I assured the interpreter I should give the men no such orders, and they must please themselves. Soon after the chief came on board, threatening to put us all to a cruel death if we refused to obey his orders. For my own part, I remained determined, and advised the men not to comply, as I thought by making ourselves useful we should be accounted too valuable. A few hours afterwards he sent to me again, saying that if myself and the quartermaster would assist them at the great guns, that if also the rest of the men went on shore and succeeded in taking the place, he would then take the money offered for our ransom, and give them $20 for each Chinaman's head they cut off. To these proposals we cheerfully acceded, in hopes of facilitating our deliverance. The Mandarin vessels continued firing, having blocked up the entrance of the harbor to prevent the Ladrone boats entering. At this the Ladrones were much exasperated, and about 300 of them swam on shore, with a short sword lashed close under each arm. They then ran along the banks of the river till they came abreast of the vessels, and then swam off again and boarded them. The Chinese, thus attacked, leapt overboard and endeavored to reach the opposite shore. The Ladrones followed, and cut the greater number of them to pieces in the water. They next towed the vessels out of the harbor, and attacked the town with increased fury. The inhabitants fought about a quarter of an hour, and then retreated to an adjacent hill, from which they were soon driven with great slaughter. After this, the Ladrones returned, and plundered the town, every boat leaving with its lading. The Chinese on the hills, perceiving most of the boats were off, rallied and retook the town, after killing nearly 200 Ladrones. One of my men was unfortunately lost in this dreadful massacre. The Ladrones landed a second time, drove the Chinese out of the town, then reduced it to ashes, and put all their prisoners to death without regard of either age or sex. I must not omit to mention a most horrid, though ludicrous circumstance which happened at this place. The Ladrones were paid by their chief $10 for every Chinaman's head they produced. One of my men, turning the corner of a street, was met by a Ladrone running furiously after a Chinese. He had a drawn sword in his hand, and 2 Chinamen's heads which he had cut off, tied by their tails and slung round his neck. I was witness myself to some of them producing 5 or 6 to obtain payment. On the 4th of November, an order arrived from the Admiral for the fleet to proceed immediately to Lantau, where he was lying with only 2 vessels, and 3 Portuguese ships and a brig constantly annoying him. Several sail of Mandarin vessels were daily expected. The fleet weighed and proceeded towards Lantau. On passing the island of Lynn, 3 ships and a brig gave chase to us. The Ladrones prepared to board, but night closing we lost sight of them. I am convinced they altered their course and stood from us. These vessels were in the pay of the Chinese government, and styled themselves the Invincible Squadron, cruising in the river Tigris to annihilate the Ladrones. On the 5th, in the morning, the Red Squadron anchored in the bay under Lantau. The Black Squadron stood to the eastward. In the afternoon of the 8th of November, 4 ships, a brig and a schooner, came off the mouth of the bay. At first the pirates were much alarmed, supposing them to be English vessels come to rescue us. Some of them threatened to hang us from the masthead for them to fire at, and with much difficulty we persuaded them that they were Portuguese. The Ladrones had only 7 junks in a fit state for action. These they hauled outside, and moored them head and stern across the bay, and manned all the boats belonging to the repairing vessels ready for boarding. The Portuguese, observing these manoeuvres, hove to, and communicated by boats. Soon afterwards they made sail, each ship firing her broadside as she passed, but without effect, the shot falling far short. The Ladrones did not return a single shot, but waved their colours and threw up their rockets, to induce them to come further in, which they might easily have done, the outside junks lying in 4 fathoms of water, which I sounded myself, though the Portuguese in their letters to Macau lamented that there was not sufficient water for them to engage closer, but that they would certainly prevent their escaping before the Mandarin fleet arrived. On the 20th of November, early in the morning, discovered an immense fleet of Mandarin vessels standing for the bay. On nearing us, they formed a line and stood close in. Each vessel, as she discharged her guns, tacked to join the rear and reload. They kept up a constant fire for about 2 hours, when one of their largest vessels was blown up by a firebrand thrown from a Ladrone junk, after which they kept at a more respectful distance, but continued firing without intermission till the 21st at night, when it fell calm. The Ladrones towed out 7 large vessels, with about 200 rowboats to board them, but a breeze springing up, they made sail and escaped. The Ladrones returned into the bay and anchored. The Portuguese and Mandarins followed, and continued a heavy cannonading during the night and the next day. The vessel I was in had her foremast shot away, which they supplied very expeditiously by taking a mainmast from a smaller vessel. On the 23rd, in the evening, it again fell calm. The Ladrones towed out 15 junks in 2 divisions, with the intention of surrounding them, which was nearly effected, having come up with and boarded one, when a breeze suddenly sprang up. The captured vessel mounted 22 guns. Most of her crew leapt overboard, 60 or 70 were taken, immediately cut to pieces and thrown into the river. Early in the morning the Ladrones returned into the bay, and anchored in the same situation as before. The Portuguese and Mandarins followed, keeping up a constant fire. The Ladrones never returned a single shot, but always kept in readiness to board, and the Portuguese were careful never to allow them an opportunity. On the 28th, at night, they sent 8 fire vessels, which, if properly constructed, must have done great execution, having every advantage they could wish for to effect their purpose. A strong breeze and a tide directed into the bay, and the vessels lying so close together that it was impossible to miss them. On their first appearance, the Ladrones gave a general shout, supposing them to be Mandarin vessels on fire, but were very soon convinced of their mistake. They came very regularly into the center of the fleet, 2 and 2, burning furiously. One of them came alongside the vessel I was in, but they succeeded in booming her off. She appeared to be a vessel of about 30 tons. Her hold was filled with straw and wood, and there were a few small boxes of combustibles on her deck, which exploded alongside of us without doing any damage. The Ladrones, however, towed them all on shore, extinguished the fire, and broke them up for firewood. The Portuguese claimed the credit of constructing these destructive machines, and actually sent a dispatch to the governor of Macao, saying they had destroyed at least 1/3 of the Ladrones' fleet, and hoped soon to effect their purpose by totally annihilating them. On the 29th of November, the Ladrones being all ready for sea, they weighed and stood boldly by, bidding defiance to the Invincible Squadron and Imperial fleet, consisting of 93 war junks, 6 Portuguese ships, a brig, and a schooner. Immediately after the Ladrones weighed, they made all sail. The Ladrones chased them 2 or 3 hours, keeping up a constant fire. Finding they did not come up with them, they hauled their wind and stood to the eastward. Thus terminated the boasted blockade, which lasted 9 days, during which time the Ladrones completed all their repairs. In this action not a single Ladrone vessel was destroyed, and their loss was about 30 or 40 men. An American was also killed, one of 3 that remained out of the 8 taken in a schooner. I had 2 very narrow escapes. The first, a 12-pounder shot fell within 3 or 4 feet of me. Another took a piece out of a small brass swivel on which I was standing. The chief's wife frequently sprinkled me with garlic water, which they considered an effectual charm against shot. The fleet continued under sail all night, steering towards the eastward. In the morning they anchored in a large bay, surrounded by lofty and barren mountains. On the 2nd of December, I received a letter from Lieutenant Morn, commander of the Honorable Company's cruiser Antelope, saying that he had the ransom on board, and had been 3 days cruising after us, and wished me to settle with the chief on the securest method of delivering it. The chief agreed to send us in a small gunboat till we came within sight of the Antelope. Then the Compradore's boat was to bring the ransom and receive us. I was so agitated at receiving this joyful news, that it was with difficulty I could scrawl about 2 or 3 lines to inform Lieutenant Morn of the arrangements I had made. We were all so deeply affected by the gratifying tidings, that we seldom closed our eyes, but continued watching day and night for the boat. On the 6th she returned with Lieutenant Morn's answer, saying he would respect any single boat, but would not allow the fleet to approach him. The chief then, according to his first proposal, ordered a gunboat to take us, and with no small degree of pleasure we left the Ladrone fleet about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. At 1 p.m. saw the Antelope under all sail, standing towards us. The Ladrone boat immediately anchored, and dispatched the Compradore's boat for the ransom, saying that if she approached nearer they would return to the fleet, and they were just weighing when she shortened sail and anchored about 2 miles from us. The boat did not reach her till late in the afternoon, owing to the tides being strong against her. She received the ransom and left the Antelope just before dark. A Mandarin boat that had been lying concealed under the land, and watching their manoeuvres, gave chase to her, and was within a few fathoms of taking her, when she saw a light, which the Ladrones answered, and the Mandarin hauled off. Our situation was now a critical one. The ransom was in the hands of the Ladrones, and the Compradore dare not return with us for fear of a second attack from the Mandarin boat. The Ladrones would not wait till morning, so we were obliged to return with them to the fleet. In the morning the chief inspected the ransom, which consisted of the following articles: 2 bales of superfine cloth, 2 chests of opium, 2 casks of gunpowder, and a telescope, the rest in dollars. He objected to the telescope not being new, and said he should detain one of us till another was sent, or $100 in lieu of it. The Compradore, however, agreed with him for the $100. Everything being at length settled, the chief ordered 2 gunboats to convey us near the Antelope. We saw her before dusk, when the Ladrone boat left us. We had the inexpressible pleasure of arriving on board the Antelope at 7 P.M., when we were most cordially received, and heartily congratulated on our safe and happy deliverance from a miserable captivity, which we had endured for 11 weeks and 3 days. Signed, Richard Glasspool, China, December the 8th, 1809. The Ladrones have no settled residence on shore, but live constantly in their vessels. The after part is appropriated to the captain and his wives. He generally has 5 or 6. With respect to the conjugal rights, they are religiously strict. No person is allowed to have a woman on board unless married to her according to their laws. Every man is allowed a small berth about 4 feet square, where he stows with his wife and family. From the number of souls crowded in so small a space, it must naturally be supposed that they are horridly dirty, which is evidently the case, and their vessels swarm with all kind of vermin. Rats in particular, which they encourage to breed and eat as great delicacies. In fact, there are very few creatures they will not eat. During our captivity we lived 3 weeks on caterpillars boiled with rice. They are much addicted to gambling, and spend all their leisure hours at cards and smoking opium. At the time of Mr. Glasspool's liberation, the pirates were at the height of their power. After such repeated victories over the Mandarin ships, they had set at naught the imperial allies, the Portuguese, and not only the coast, but the rivers of the Celestial Empire seemed to be at their discretion. And yet their formidable association did not many months survive this event. It was not, however, defeat that reduced it to the obedience of the laws. On the contrary, that extraordinary woman, the widow of Cheng Yi, and the daring Paou were victorious and more powerful than ever, when dissensions broke out amongst the pirates themselves. Ever since the favor of the chieftainess had elevated Paou to the general command, there had been enmity and altercations between him and the chief, O po Tai, who commanded one of the flags or divisions of the fleet, and it was only by the deference and respect they both owed to Cheng Yi's widow that they had been prevented from turning their arms against each other long before. At length, when the brave Paou was surprised and cooped up by a strong blockading force of the Emperor's ships, O po Tai showed all his deadly spite, and refused to obey the orders of Paou, and even of the chieftainess, which were that he should sail to the relief of his rival. Paou, with his bravery and usual good fortune, broke through the blockade, but when he came in contact with O po Tai, his rage was too violent to be restrained. O po Tai at first pleaded that his means and strength had been insufficient to do what had been expected of him, but concluded by saying, "Am I bound to come and join the forces of Paou?" "Would you then separate before us?" cried Paou, more enraged than ever. O po Tai answered, "I will not separate myself." "How? Why then do you not obey the orders of the wife of Cheng Yi and my own? What is this else than separation, that you do not come to assist me when I am surrounded by the enemy? I have sworn it that I will destroy thee, wicked man, that I may do away with this soreness on my back." The summons of Paou when blockaded to O po Tai was in language equally figurative. "I am harassed by the government's officers outside in the sea. Lips and teeth must help one another. If the lips are cut away, the teeth will feel cold. How shall I alone be able to fight the government forces? You should therefore come to the head of your crew to attack the government squadron in the rear. I will then come out of my station and make an attack in front. The enemy be so taken in the front and rear, will, even supposing we cannot master him, certainly be thrown into disorder." The angry words of Paou were followed by others, and then by blows. Paou, though at the moment far inferior in force, first began the fight, and ultimately sustained a sanguinary defeat, and the loss of 16 vessels. Our loathing for this cruel, detestable race must be increased by the fact that the victors massacred all their prisoners, or 300 men. This was the death blow to the confederacy which had so long defied the Emperor's power, and which might have effected his dethronement. O po Tai, dreading the vengeance of Paou and his mistress, Cheng Yi's widow, whose united forces would have quintupled his own, gained over his men to his views, and proffered a submission to government on condition of free pardon and a proper provision for all. The petition of the pirates is so curious a production, and so characteristic of the Chinese, that it deserves to be inserted at length. It is my humble opinion that all robbers of an overwhelming force, whether they had their origin from this or any other cause, have felt the humanity of government at different times. Liang Shang, who 3 years plundered the city, was nevertheless pardoned, and at last made a minister of state. Wakang often challenged the arms of the country, and he was suffered to live, and at last made a cornerstone of the empire. Ju Ming pardoned 7 times Mang Huao, and Kwang Kung 3 times set Chao Chao at liberty. Ma Huen persuaded not the exhausted robbers, and Yo Fai killed not those who made their submission. There are many instances of such transactions both in former and recent times, by which the country was strengthened, and government increased its power. We now live in a very populous age. Some of us could not agree with their relations, and were driven out like noxious weeds. Some, after having tried all they could, without being able to provide for themselves, at last joined bad society. Some lost their property by shipwrecks. Some withdrew into this watery empire to escape from punishment. In such a way, those who in the beginning were only 3 or 5 were in the course of time increased to 1,000 or 10,000, and so it went on increasing every year. Would it not have been wonderful if such a multitude, being in want of their daily bread, had not resorted to plunder and robbery to gain their subsistence, since they could not in any other manner be saved from famine? It was from necessity that the laws of the empire were violated, and the merchants robbed of their goods. Being deprived of our land and of our native places, having no house or home to resort to, and relying only on the chance of wind and water, even could we for a moment forget our griefs, we might fall in with a man of war, who with stones, darts, and guns would knock out our brains. Even if we dared to sail up a stream, and boldly go on, with anxiety of mind under wind, rain, and stormy weather, we must everywhere prepare for fighting. Whether we went to the east or to the west, and after having felt all the hardships of the sea, the night dew was our only dwelling, and the rude wind our meal. But now we will avoid these perils, leave our connections, and desert our comrades. We will make our submission. The power of government knows no bounds. It reaches to the islands in the sea, and every man is afraid, and sighs. Oh, we must be destroyed by our crimes. None can escape who opposeth the laws of the government. May you then feel compassion for those who are deserving of death. May you sustain us by your humanity. The government that had made so many lamentable displays of its weakness were glad to make an unreal parade of its mercy. It was but too unhappy to grant all the conditions instantly, and in the fulsome language of its historians, feeling that compassion is the way of heaven, that it is the right way to govern by righteousness, it therefore redeemed these pirates from destruction, and pardoned their former crimes. O po Tai, however, then struck his free flag, and the pirates were hardly in the power of the Chinese, when it was proposed by many that they should all be treacherously murdered. The governor happened to be more honorable and humane, or probably only more politic than those who had made this foul proposal. He knew that such a bloody breach of faith would forever prevent the pirates still in arms from voluntarily submitting. He knew equally well, even weakened as they were by O po Tai's defection, that the government could not reduce them by force, and he thought by keeping his faith with them he might turn the force of those who had submitted against those who still held out, and so destroy the pirates with the pirates. Consequently, the 8,000 men it had been proposed to cut off in cold blood were allowed to remain uninjured, and their leader, O po Tai, having changed his name to that of Ho Bin, or the Lustre of Instruction, was elevated to the rank of an imperial officer. The widow of Cheng Yi and her favorite Pao continued for some months to pillage the coast, and to beat the Chinese and the Mandarin's troops and ships, and seemed almost as strong as before the separation of O po Tai's flag. But that example was probably operating in the minds of many of the outlaws, and finally the lawless heroine herself, It was the spirit that kept the complicated body together. Seeing that O po tae had been made a government officer, and that he continued to prosper, began also to think of making her submission. "I am," said she, "10 times stronger than O po tae, and government will perhaps, if I submit, act towards me as they have done with O po tae." A rumor of her intentions having reached shore, the mandarins sent off a Captain Chow, a doctor of Macao, who, said the historian, being already well acquainted with the pirates, did not need any introduction, to enter on preliminaries with them. When the worthy practitioner presented himself to Paou, that friend concluded he had been committing some crime, and had come for safety to that general refugium peccatorum, the pirate fleet. The doctor explained, and assured the chief that if he would submit, government was inclined to treat him and his far more favorably and more honorably than O po tae, but if he continued to resist, not only a general arming of all the coasts and rivers, but O po tae was to proceed against him. At this part of his narrative, our Chinese historian is again so curious that I shall quote his words at length. When Fai Hiang Chow came to Paou, he said, "Friend Paou, do you know why I come to you?" Paou: "Thou hast committed some crime, and comest to me for protection." Chow: "By no means." Paou: "You will then know how it stands concerning the report about our submission, if it is true or false?" Chow: "You are again wrong here, sir. What are you in comparison with O po tae?" Paou: "Who is bold enough to compare me with O po tae?" Chow: "I know very well that O po tae could not come up to you, sir. But I mean only that since O po tae has made his submission, since he has got his pardon and been created a government officer, how would it be if you with your whole crew were also to submit, and if his Excellency should desire to treat you in the same manner, and to give you the same rank as O po tae? Your submission would produce more joy to government than the submission of O po tae. You should not wait for wisdom to act wisely. You should make up your mind to submit to the government with all your followers. I will assist you in every respect. It would be the means of securing your own happiness and the lives of all your adherents." Chang Paou remained like a statue without motion, and Fai Huang Chow went on to say, "You should think about this affair in time, and not stay till the last moment. Is it not clear that O po tae, since you could not agree together, has joined government? He being enraged against you, will fight, united with the forces of the government, for your destruction. And who could help you, so that you might overcome your enemies? If O po tae could before vanquish you quite alone, how much more can he now, when he is united with the government? O po tae will then satisfy his hatred against you, and you yourself will soon be taken either at Wei Chow or at Niao Chow. If the merchant vessels of Hu Chow, the boats of Kwang Chow, and all the fishing vessels unite together to surround and attack you in the open sea, you will certainly have enough to do. But even supposing they should not attack you, you will soon feel the want of provisions to sustain you and all your followers. It is always wisdom to provide before things happen. Stupidity and folly never think about future events. It is too late to reflect upon events when things have happened. You should therefore consider this matter in time." Paou was puzzled, but after being closeted for some time with his mistress, Cheng Yi's widow, who gave her high permission for him to make arrangements with Dr. Chow, he said he would repair with his fleet to the Boca Tigris, and there communicate personally with the organs of government. After 2 visits had been paid to the pirate fleets by 2 inferior mandarins, who carried the inferior proclamation of free pardon, and who, at the order of Ching Yi's widow, were treated to a sumptuous banquet by Paou, the Governor General of the province went himself in one vessel to the pirate ships that occupied a line of 10 li off the mouth of the river. As the governor approached, the pirates hoisted their flags, played on their instruments, and fired their guns, so that the smoke rose in clouds, and then bent sail to meet him. On this, the dense population that were ranged thousands after thousands along the shore to witness the important reconciliation became sorely alarmed, and the Governor General seemed to have had a strong inclination to run away. But in brief space of time, the long dreaded widow of Cheng Yi, supported by the Lieutenant Paou, and followed by 3 other of her principal commanders, mounted the side of the governor's ship, and rushed through the smoke to the spot where his Excellency was stationed. When they fell on their hands and knees, shed tears, knocked their heads on the deck before him, and received his gracious pardon, and promised for future kind treatment. They then withdrew satisfied, having promised to give in a list of their ships, and of all else they possessed within 3 days. But the sudden apparition of some large Portuguese ships, and some government war junks, made the pirates suspect treachery. They immediately set sail, and negotiations were interrupted for several days. They were at last concluded by the boldness of their female leader. "If the Governor General," said this heroine, "a man of the highest rank, could come out to us quite alone, why should not I, a mean woman, go to the officers of government? If there be danger in it, I take it all on myself. No person among you need trouble himself about me. My mind is made up, and I will go to Canton." Paou said, "If the widow of Ching Yih goes, we must all fix a time for her return. If this pass without our obtaining any information, we must collect all our forces and go before Canton. This is my opinion as to what ought to be done. Comrades, let me hear yours." The pirates then struck with the intrepidity of their chieftainess, and loving her more than ever, answered, "Friend Paou, we have heard thy opinion, but we think it better to wait for the news here, on the water, than to send the wife of Ching Yih alone to be killed." Nor would they allow her to leave the fleet. Matters were in this state of indecision, when the 2 inferior mandarins, who had before visited the pirates, ventured out to repeat their visit. These officers protested no treachery had been intended, and pledged themselves that if the widow of Ching Yih would repair to the governor, she would be kindly received, and everything settled to their heart's satisfaction. With this, in the language of our old ballads, up spoke Miss Cheng. "You say well, gentlemen, and I will go myself to Canton with some of our other ladies, accompanied by you." And accordingly, she and a number of the pirates' wives and their children went fearlessly to Canton, arranged everything, and found that they had not been deceived. The fleet soon followed. On its arrival, every vessel was supplied with pork and with wine, and every man, in lieu it must be supposed of the share of the vessels and plundered property he resigned, received at the same time a bill for a certain quantity of money. Those who wished it could join the military force of government for pursuing the remaining pirates, and those who objected dispersed and withdrew into the country. This is the manner in which the great red squadron of the pirates was pacified. The valiant Paou, following the example of his rival O po Tai, entered into the service of government, and proceeded against such of his former associates and friends as would not accept the pardon offered them. There was some hard fighting, but the 2 renegadoes successfully took the chief Shi Ul, forced the redoubtable captain, styled the Scourge of the Eastern Ocean, to surrender himself, drove Frog's Meal, another dreadful pirate, to Manila, and finally, and within a few months, destroyed or dissipated the wasps of the ocean together. I have already noticed the marked intention of the Chinese historian to paint the character of Paou in a poetic or epic manner. When describing the battle with Shi Ul, he says, "They fought from 7 o'clock in the morning till 1 at noon, burnt 10 vessels, and killed an immense number of the pirates. Shi Ul was so weakened that he could scarcely make any opposition. On perceiving this through the smoke, Paou mounted on a sudden the vessel of the pirate, and cried out, 'I, Chang Paou, am come,' and at the same moment he cut some pirate to pieces. The remainder were then hardly dealt with. Paou addressed himself in an angry tone to Shi Ul, and said, 'I advise you to submit. Will you not follow my advice? What have you to say?' Shi Ul was struck with amazement, and his courage left him. Paou advanced and bound him, and the whole crew were then taken captives. From that period," says our Chinese historian, in conclusion, "ships began to pass and repass in tranquillity. All became quiet on the rivers and tranquil on the 4 seas. People lived in peace and plenty. Men sold their arms and bought oxen to plow their field. They buried sacrifice and said prayers on top of the hills, and rejoiced themselves by singing behind screens during daytime, and, grand climax to all, The governor of the province, in consideration of all his valuable services in the pacification of the pirates, was allowed by an edict of the Son of Heaven to wear peacock's feathers with 2 eyes. End of chapter 18.
Chapter 19 of the Pirate's Own Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Pirate's Own Book by Charles Ellms. Chapter 19. The Life of Captain Lewis. Captain Lewis was at an early age associated with pirates. We first find him a boy in company with the pirate Bannister, who was hanged at the yardarm of a man-of-war, inside of Port Royal, Jamaica. This Lewis and another boy were taken with him, and brought into the island hanging by the middle at the Mizen Peak. He had a great aptitude for languages, and spoke perfectly well that of the Mosquil Indians, French, Spanish, and English. I mention our own, because it is doubted whether he was French or English, for we cannot trace him back to his origin. He sailed out of Jamaica till he was a lusty lad, and was then taken by the Spaniards at the Havana, where he tarried some time. But at length he and 6 more ran away with a small canoe, and surprised a Spanish periagua, out of which 2 men joined them, so that they were now 9 in company. With this periagua they surprised a turtling sloop, and forced some of the hands to take on with them. The others they sent away in the periagua. He played at this small game, surprising and taking coasters and turtlers, till with forced men and volunteers he made up a company of 40 men. With these he took a large pink-built ship, bound for Jamaica to the Bay of Campeachy, and after her several others bound to the same place. And having intelligence that there lay in the bay a fine Bermuda-built brigantine of 10 guns, commanded by Captain Tucker, he sent the captain of the Pink to him with a letter, the purport of which was, that he wanted such a brigantine, and if he would part with her, he would pay him 10,000 pieces of 8. If he refused this, he would take care to lie in his way, for he was resolved, either by fair or foul means, to have the vessel. Captain Tucker, having read the letter, sent for the masters of vessels then lying in the bay, and told them, after he had shown the letter, that if they would make him up 54 men, for there were about 10 Bermuda sloops, he would go out and fight the pirates. They said no, they would not hazard their men. They depended on their sailing, and every one must take care of himself as well as he could. However, they all put to sea together, and spied a sail under the land, which had a breeze while they lay becalmed. Some said he was a turtler, others the pirate, and so it proved, for it was honest Captain Lewis, who, putting out his oars, got in among them. Some of the sloops had 4 guns, some 2, some none. Joseph Dill had 2, which he brought on one side and fired smartly at the pirate, but unfortunately one of them split and killed 3 men. Tucker called to all the sloops to send him men, and he would fight Lewis, but to no purpose. Nobody came on board him. In the meanwhile a breeze sprung up, and Tucker, trimming his sails, left them, who all fell a prey to the pirate, into whom, however, he fired a broadside at going off. One sloop, whose master I will not name, was a very good sailor and was going off, but Lewis, firing a shot, brought her to, and he lay by till all the sloops were visited and secured. Then Lewis sent on board him, and ordered the master into his sloop. As soon as he was on board, he asked the reason of him lying by and betraying the trust his owners had reposed in him, which was doing like a knave and coward, and he would punish him accordingly. For, said he, you might have got off, being so much a better sailor than my vessel. After this speech, he fell upon him with a rope's end, and then, snatching up his cane, drove him about the decks without mercy. The master, thinking to pacify him, told him he had been out trading in that sloop several months, and had on board a good quantity of money, which was hid, and which, if he would send on board a black belonging to the owners, he would discover to him. This had not the desired effect, but one quite contrary, for Lewis told him he was a rascal and villain for this discovery, and he would pay him for betraying his owners, and redoubled his strokes. However, he sent and took the money and negro, who was an able sailor. He took out of his prizes what he had occasion for, 40 able negro sailors and a white carpenter. The largest sloop, which was about 90 tons, he took for his own use and mounted her with 12 guns. His crew was now about 80 men, whites and blacks. After these captures, he cruised in the Gulf of Florida, laying in wait for the West India homeward bound ships that took the leeward passage, several of which, falling into his hands, were plundered by him and released. From hence he went to the coast of Carolina, where he cleaned his sloop, and a great many men whom he had forced ran away from him. However, the natives traded with him for rum and sugar, and brought him all he wanted, without the government's having any knowledge of him, for he had got into a very private creek, though he was very much on his guard, that he might not be surprised from the shore. From Carolina he cruised on the coast of Virginia, where he took and plundered several merchantmen, and forced several men, and then returned to the coast of Carolina, where he did abundance of mischief. As he had now an abundance of French on board, who had entered with him, and Lewis, hearing the English had a design to maroon them, he secured the men he suspected, and put them in a boat with all the other English, 10 leagues from shore, with only 10 pieces of beef, and sent them away, keeping none but French and negroes. These men, it is supposed, all perished in the sea. From the coast of Carolina he shaped his course for the banks of Newfoundland, where he overhauled several fishing vessels, and then went into Trinity Harbor in Conception Bay, where there lay several merchantmen, and seized a 24-gun galley called the Herman. The commander, Captain Beale, told Lewis if he would send his quartermaster ashore he would furnish him with necessaries. He being sent ashore, a council was held among the masters, the consequence of which was the seizing the quartermaster, whom they carried to Captain Woodes Rogers. He chained him to a sheet anchor which was ashore, and planted guns at the point to prevent the pirate getting out, but to little purpose, for the people at one of these points firing too soon, Lewis quitted the ship, and by the help of oars and the favor of the night got out in his sloop, though she received many shot in her hull. The last shot that was fired at the pirate did him considerable damage. He lay off and on the harbor, swearing he would have his quartermaster, and intercepted 2 fishing shallops, on board of one of which was the captain of the galley's brother. He detained them, and sent word, if his quartermaster did not immediately come off, he would put all his prisoners to death. He was sent on board without hesitation. Lewis and the crew inquired how he had been used, and he answered very civilly, "It's well," said the pirate, "for had you been ill treated, I would have put all these rascals to the sword." They were dismissed, and the captain's brother going over the side, the quartermaster stopped him, saying he must drink the gentleman's health ashore, particularly Captain Rogers's, and whispering him in the ear, told him, if they had known of his being chained all night, he would have been cut in pieces, with all his men. After this poor man and his shallop's company were gone, the quartermaster told the usage he had met with, which enraged Lewis, and made him reproach his quartermaster, whose answer was, that he did not think it just the innocent should suffer for the guilty. The masters of the merchantmen sent to Captain Tudor Trevor, who lay at St. John's in the Sheerness man of war. He immediately got under sail, and missed the pirate but 4 hours. She kept along the coast and made several prizes, French and English, and put into a harbor where a French ship lay making fish. She was built at the latter end of the war, for a privateer was an excellent sailor, and mounted 24 guns. The commander hailed him. The pirate answered from Jamaica with rum and sugar. The Frenchman bid him go about his business, that a pirate sloop was on the coast, and he might be the rogue. If he did not immediately sheer off, he would fire a broadside into him. He went off and lay a fortnight out at sea, so far as not to be descried from the shore, with resolution to have the ship. The Frenchman being on his guard, in the meanwhile raised a battery on the shore, which commanded the harbor. After a fortnight, when he was thought to be gone off, he returned, and took 2 of the fishing shallops belonging to the Frenchman, and manning them with pirates, they went in. One shallop attacked the battery, the other surprised, boarded, and carried the ship just as the Morning Star appeared, for which reason he gave her that name. In the engagement the owner's son was killed, who made the voyage out of curiosity only. The ship being taken, 7 guns were fired, which was the signal, and the sloop came down and lay alongside the ship. The captain told him he supposed he only wanted his liquor, but Lewis made answer he wanted his ship, and accordingly hoisted all his ammunition and provision into her. When the Frenchman saw they would have his ship, he told her trim, and Lewis gave him the sloop, and accepting what he took for provision, all the fish he had made. Several of the French took on with him, who with others, English and French, had by force or voluntarily made him up 200 men. From Newfoundland he steered for the coast of Guinea, where he took a great many ships, English, Dutch, and Portuguese. Among these ships was one belonging to Carolina, commanded by Captain Smith. While he was in chase of this vessel a circumstance occurred, which made his men believe he dealt with the devil. His fore and maintop mast being carried away, he, Lewis, running up the shrouds to the maintop, tore off a handful of hair, and throwing it into the air, used this expression, "Good devil, take this till I come." And it was observed that he came afterwards faster up with the chase than before the loss of his topmasts. Smith being taken, Lewis used him very civilly, and gave him as much or more in value than he took from him, and let him go, saying he would come to Carolina when he had made money on the coast, and would rely on his friendship. They kept some time on the coast, when they quarrelled among themselves, the French and English, of which the former were more numerous, and they resolved to part. The French therefore chose a large sloop newly taken, thinking the ship's bottom, which was not sheathed, damaged by the worms. According to this agreement, they took on board what ammunition and provision they thought fit out of the ship, and put off, choosing one Labarre captain. As it blew hard, and the decks were encumbered, they came to an anchor under the coast, to stow away their ammunition, goods, etc. Lewis told his men they were a parcel of rogues, and he would make them refund. Accordingly he run alongside, his guns being all loaded and new primed, and ordered him to cut away his mast, or he would sink him. Labarre was obliged to obey. Then he ordered them all ashore. They begged the liberty of carrying their arms, goods, etc., with them, but he allowed them only their small arms and cartridge boxes. Then he brought the sloop alongside, put everything on board the ship, and sunk the sloop. Labarre and the rest begged to be taken on board. However, though he denied them, he suffered Labarre and some few to come, with whom he and his men drank plentifully. The negroes on board Lewis told him the French had a plot against him. He answered he could not withstand his destiny, for the devil told him in the great cabin he should be murdered that night. In the dead of the night, the rest of the French came on board in canoes, got into the cabin, and killed Lewis. They fell on the crew, but after an hour and a half's dispute, the French were beaten off, and the quartermaster, John Cornelius, an Irishman, succeeded Lewis. He was the mildest mannered man that ever scuttled ship or cut a throat. With such true breeding of a gentleman, you never could discern his real thought. Pity he loved an adventurous life's variety. He was so great a loss to good society. End of chapter 19.
Of the Pirate's Own Book. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Logan McCammon. The Pirate's Own Book by Charles Ellms. Chapter 20. The Life, Career, and Death of Captain Thomas White. He was born at Plymouth, where his mother kept a public house. She took great care of his education, and when he was grown up, as he had an inclination to the sea, procured him the king's letter. After he had served some years on board a man of war, he went to Barbados, where he married, got into the merchant service, and designed to settle in the island. He had the command of the Marigold brigantine given to him, in which he made 2 successful voyages to Guinea and back to Barbados. In his third, he had the misfortune to be taken by a French pirate, as were several other English ships, the masters and inferior officers of which they detained being in want of good artists. The brigantine belonging to White they kept for their own use, and sunk the vessel they before sailed in. But meeting with the ship on the Guinea coast more fit for their purpose, they went on board her and burnt the brigantine. It is not my business here to give an account of this French pirate, any further than Captain White's story obliges me, though I beg leave to take notice of their barbarity to the English prisoners, for they would set them up as a butt or mark to shoot at, several of whom were thus murdered in cold blood, by way of diversion. White was marked out for a sacrifice by only of these villains, who, for what reason I know not, had sworn his death, which he escaped thus. One of the crew, who had a friendship for White, knew this fellow's design to kill him in the night, and therefore advised him to lie between him and the ship's side, with intention to save him, which indeed he did, but was himself shot by the murderous villain, who mistook him for White. After some time cruising along the coast, the pirates doubled the Cape of Good Hope, and shaped their course for Madagascar, where, being drunk and mad, they knocked their ship on the head, at the south end of the island, at a place called by the natives Alexa. The country thereabouts was governed by a king, named Mafeli. When the ship struck Captain White, Captain Borman, born in the Isles of Wight, formerly a lieutenant of a man of war, but in the merchant service when he fell into the hands of the pirates, Captain Bowen and some other prisoners got into the longboat, and with broken oars and barrel staves, which they found in the bottom of the boat, paddled to Augustin Bay, which is about 14 or 15 leagues from the wreck, where they landed, and were kindly received by the King of Bavaw, the name of that part of the island, who spoke good English. They stayed here a year and a half at the king's expense, who gave them a plentiful allowance of provisions, as was his custom to all white men, who met with any misfortunes on his coast. His humanity not only provided for such, but the first European vessel that came in he always obliged to take in the unfortunate people, let the vessel be what it would, for he had no notion of any difference between pirates and merchants. At the expiration of the above term, a pirate brigantine came in, on board which the king obliged them to enter, or travel by land to some other place, which they durst not do, and of 2 evils chose the least, that of going on board the pirate vessel, which was commanded by one William Reed, who received them very civilly. This commander went along the coast, and picked up what Europeans he could meet with. His crew, however, did not exceed 40 men. He would have been glad of taking some of the wrecked Frenchmen, but for the barbarity they had used towards the English prisoners, however, it was impracticable. For the French, pretending to lord it over the natives, whom they began to treat inhumanly, were set upon by them, 1/2 of their number cut off, and the other half made slaves. Reed, with his gang and a brigantine of 60 tons, steered his course for the Persian Gulf, where they met a grab, a 1-mast vessel of about 200 tons, which was made a prize. They found nothing on board but bale goods, most of which they threw overboard in search of gold, and to make room in the vessel, but as they learned afterwards, they threw over, in their search, what they so greedily hunted for there was a considerable quantity of gold concealed in one of the bales they tossed into the sea. In this cruise Captain Reed fell ill and died, and was succeeded by one James. The brigantine being small, crazy, and worm-eating, they shaped their course for the island of Mayotta, where they took out the masts of the brigantine, fitted up the grab, and made a ship of her. Here they took in a quantity of fresh provisions, which are in this island very plentiful and very cheap, and found a 12-oared boat, which formerly belonged to the Ruby East Indiamen, which had been lost there. They stayed here all the monsoon time, which is about 6 months, after which they resolved for Madagascar. As they came in with the land, they spied a sail coming round from the east side of the island. They gave chase on both sides, so that they soon met. They hailed each other, and receiving the same answer from each vessel, viz. from the other seas, they joined company. This vessel was a small French ship, laden with liquors from Martinico, first commanded by one Forget, to trade for the pirates with slaves at Ambonavoula, on the east side of the island, in the latitude of 17 degrees 30 minutes, and was by them taken over by the following manner. The pirates, who were headed by George Booth, now commander of the ship, went on board, as they had often done, to the number of 10, and carried money with them under pretence of purchasing what they wanted. This Booth had formerly been gunner of a pirate ship, called the Dolphin. Captain Forget was pretty much upon his guard, and searched every man as he came over the side, and a pair of pocket pistols were found upon a Dutchman, who was the first that entered. The captain told him that he was a rogue, and had design upon his ship, and the pirates pretended to be so angry with this fellow's offering to come on board with arms, that they threatened to knock him on the head, and tossing him roughly into the boat, ordered him ashore, though they had before taken an oath on Bible either to carry the ship or die in the undertaking. They were all searched, but they however contrived to get on board 4 pistols, which were all the arms they had for the enterprise, though Forget had 20 hands on board, and his small arms on the awning, to be in readiness. The captain invited them into the cabin to dinner, but Booth chose to dine with the petty officer, though one Johnson, Isaac, and another, went down. Booth was to give the watchword, which was "Hurrah!" Standing near the awning, and being a nimble fellow, at one spring he threw himself upon it, drew the arms to him, fired his pistol among the men, one of whom he wounded, who jumping overboard was lost, and gave the signal. 3, I said, were in the cabin, and 7 upon deck, who with handspikes and the arms seized secured the ship's crew. The captain and his 2 mates, who were at dinner in the cabin, hearing the pistol, fell upon Johnson, and stabbed him in several places with their forks, but they being silver, did him no great damage. Forget snatched his piece, which he snapped at Isaac's breast several times, but it would not go off. At last, finding his resistance vain, he submitted, and the pirates set him, and those of his men who would not join them on shore, allowing him to take his books, papers, and whatever else he claimed as belonging to himself, and besides treating him very humanely, gave him several casks of liquor, and arms and powder, to purchase provisions in the country. I hope this discretion, as it was in a manner needful, will be excused. I shall now proceed. After they had taken in the Dolphin's company, which were on the island, and increased their crew, by that means, to the number of 80 hands, they had sailed to St. Mary's, where Captain Mawson's ship lay at anchor, between the island and the main. This gentleman and his whole ship's company had been cut off at the instigation of Ort Van Til, a Dutchman of New York. Out of her they took water casks and other necessaries, which having done, they designed for the river Methelage, on the west side of Madagascar, in the latitude of 16 degrees or thereabouts, to salt up provisions, and to proceed to the East Indies, cruise off the islands of St. John, and lie in wait for the more ships for Mocha. In their way to Methelage they fell in, as I have said, with the pirate, on board of which was Captain White. They joined company, came to an anchor together in the above named river, where they had cleaned, salted, and took in their provisions, and were ready to go to sea, when a large ship appeared in sight, and stood into the same river. The pirates knew not whether she was a merchantman or man of war. She had been the latter, belonging to the French king, and could mount 50 guns, but being taken by the English, she was bought by some London merchants, and fitted out from that port to slave at Madagascar, and go to Jamaica. The captain was a young, inexperienced man, who was put in with a nurse. The pirates sent their boats to speak with them, but the ship firing at them, they concluded it a man of war, and rowed ashore. The Grab standing in, and not keeping her wind so well as the French-built ship, run among a parcel of mangroves, and a stump piercing her bottom, she sunk, the other run aground, let go her anchor, and came to no damage, for the tide of flood fetched her off. The captain of the Speaker, for that was the name of the ship which frightened the pirates, was not a little vain of having forced these 2 vessels ashore, though he did not know whether they were pirates or merchantmen, and could not help expressing himself in these words: "How will my name ring on the exchange, when it is known I have run 2 pirates aground?" Which gave handle to a satirical return from one of his men after he was taken, who said, "Lord, how our captain's name will ring on the exchange, when it is heard he frightened 2 pirate ships ashore, and was taken by their boats afterwards." When the Speaker came within shot, she fired several times at the 2 vessels, and when she came to anchor, several more into the country, which alarmed the negroes, who, acquainting their king, he would allow him no trade, till the pirates living ashore, and who had a design on his ship, interceded for them, telling the king they were their countrymen, and what had happened was through a mistake, it being a custom among them to fire their guns by way of respect, and it was owing to the gunner of the ship's negligence that they fired shot. The captain of the Speaker sent his purser ashore to go up the country to the king, who lived about 24 miles from the coast, to carry a couple of small arms inlaid with gold, a couple of brass blunderbusses, and a pair of pistols as presents, and to require trade. As soon as the purser was ashore, he was taken prisoner by one Tom Collins, a Welshman, born in Pembroke, who lived on shore, and had belonged to the charming Mary of Barbados, which went out with a commission but was converted to a pirate. He told the purser he was his prisoner, and must answer the damage done to 2 merchants who were slaving. The purser answered that he was not commander, that the captain was a hot rash youth, put into business by his friends, which he did not understand. But however, satisfaction should be made. He was carried by Collins on board Booth's ship, where, at first, he was talked to in pretty strong terms, but after a while very civilly used, and the next morning sent up to the king with a guide, and peace made for him. The king allowed them trade, and sent down the usual presents, a couple of oxen between 20 and 30 people laden with rice, and as many more with the country liquor called toke. The captain then settled the factory on the shore side, and began to buy slaves and provisions. The pirates were among them, and had opportunities of sounding the men, and knowing in what posture the ship lay, they found by one human, belonging to the speaker, that there were not above 40 men on board, and that they had lost the second mate and 20 hands in the longboat, on the coast, before they came into this harbor, but that they kept a good lookout, and had their guns ready primed. However, he, for 100 pounds, undertook to wet all the priming, and assist in taking the ship. After some days the captain of the speaker came on shore, and was received with great civility by the heads of the pirates, having agreed before to make satisfaction. And a day or 2 after, he was invited by them to eat a barbecued shoat, which invitation he accepted. After dinner Captain Bowen, who was, I have already said, a prisoner on board the French pirate, but now become one of the fraternity, and master of the grab, went out and returned with a case of pistols in his hand, and told the captain of the speaker, whose name I won't mention, that he was his prisoner. He asked, upon what account? Bowen answered, they wanted his ship, his was a good one, and they were resolved to have her, to make amends for the damage he had done them. In the meanwhile his boat's crew and the rest of the men ashore were told by others of the pirates, who were drinking with them, that they were also prisoners. Some of them answered, zounds, we don't trouble our heads what we are, let's have t'other bowl of punch. A watchword was given, and no boat to be admitted on the ship. This word, which was for that night, Coventry, was known to them. At 8 o'clock they manned the 12-oared boat, and the one they found at Mayotta with 24 men, and set out for the ship. When they were put off, the captain of the speaker desired them to come back, as he wanted to speak with them. Captain Booth asked what he wanted. He said, they could never take his ship. Then, said Booth, we'll die in or alongside of her. But, replied the captain, if you will go with safety, don't board on the larboard side, for there is a gun out of the steerage loaded with partridge, which will clear the docks. They thanked him, and proceeded. When they were near the ship they were hailed, and the answer was, the Coventry. All well, said the mate, get the lights over the side. But spying the second boat, he asked what boat that was. One answered it was a raft of water, another that it was a boat of beef. This disagreement in the answers made the mate suspicious, who cried out, pirates, take your arms, my lads, and immediately clapped a match to a gun, which, as the primary was before wet by the treachery of Human, only fizzed. They boarded in the instant, and made themselves masters of her, without the loss of a man on either side. The next day they put necessary provisions on board the French-built ship, and gave her to the captain of the speaker, and those men who would go off with him, among whom was man, who had betrayed his ship, for the pirates had both paid him the 100 I agreed, and kept his secret. The captain having thus lost his ship, sailed in that which the pirates gave him, for Johanna, where he fell ill and died with grief. The pirates having here victualled, they sailed for the bay of St. Augustine, where they took in between 70 and 80 men, who had belonged to the ship Alexander, commanded by Captain James, a pirate. They also took up her guns, and mounted the speaker with 54, which made up their number, and 240 men, besides slaves, of which they had about 20. From hence they sailed for the East Indies, but they stopped at Zanzibar for fresh provisions, where the Portuguese had once a settlement, but now inhabited by Arabians. Some of them went ashore with the captain to buy provisions. The captain was sent for by the governor, who went with about 14 in company. They passed through the guard, and where they had entered the governor's house, they were all cut off, and, at the same time, others who were in different houses in the town were set upon, which made them fly to the shore. The longboat, which lay off a grappling, was immediately put in by those who looked after her, where there were not above half a dozen of the pirates who brought their arms ashore, but they piled them so well, for they were in the boat, that most of the men got into her. The quartermaster ran down sword in hand, and though he was attacked by many, he behaved himself so well, that he got into a little canoe, put off, and reached the longboat. In the interim, the little fort the Arabians had played upon the ship, which returned the salute very warmly. Thus they got on board, with the loss of Captain Booth and 20 men, and set sail for the East Indies. When they were under sail, they went to voting for a new captain, and the quartermaster, who had behaved so well in the last affair with the Arabians, was chosen. But he declining all command, the crew made choice of Bowen for captain, Pickering to succeed him as master, Samuel Herot, a Frenchman, for quartermaster, and Nathaniel North for captain quartermaster. Things being thus settled, they came to the mouth of the Red Sea, and fell in with 13 sail of Moor ships, which they kept company with the greater part of the day, but afraid to venture on them, as they took them for Portuguese men of war, at length part were for boarding, and advised it. The captain, though he said little, did not seem inclined, for he was but a young pirate, though an old commander of a merchantman. Those who pushed for boarding then desired Captain Boorman, already mentioned, to take the command, but he said he would not be an usurper, that nobody was more fit for it than he who had it, that for his part he would stand by his foozle, and went forward to the forecastle with such as would have him take the command, to be ready to board, on which the captain's quartermaster said, if they were resolved to engage, their captain, whose representative he was, did not want resolution, therefore ordered them to get their tacks on board, for they had already made a clear ship, and get ready for boarding, which they accordingly did, and coming up with the sternmost ship, they fired a broadside into her, which killed 2 Moors, clapped her on board and carried her, but night coming on, they made only this prize, which yielded them £500 per man. From hence they sailed to the coast of Malabar. The adventures of these pirates on this coast are already set down in Captain Bowen's life, to which I refer the reader, and shall only observe, that Captain White was all this time before the mast, being a forced man from the beginning. Bowen's crew dispersing, Captain White went to Methelage, where he lived ashore with the king, not having an opportunity of getting off the island, till another pirate ship, called the Prosperous, commanded by one Howard, who had been bred a lighterman on the river Thames, came in. This ship was taken at Augustine by some pirates from shore, and the crew of their longboat, which joined them, at the instigation of one Ranton, boatswain mate, who sent for water, they came on board in the night and surprised her, though not without resistance, in which the captain and chief mate were killed, and several others wounded. Those who were ashore with Captain White, resolving to enter in this ship, determined him to go also, rather than be left alone with the natives, hoping, by some accident or other, to have an opportunity of returning home. He continued on board the ship, in which he was made quartermaster, till they met with, and all went on board of Bowen, as is set down in his life, in which ship he continued after Bowen left them. At Port Dolphin he went off in the boats to fetch some of the crew ashore, the ship being blown to sea the night before, the ship not being able to get in, and he supposing her gone to the west side of the island, as they had formerly proposed, he steered that course in the boat with 26 men. They touched at Augustine, expecting the ship, but she not appearing in a week, the time they waited, the king ordered them to be gone, telling them they imposed on him with lies, for he did not believe they had any ship. However, he gave them fresh provision. They took in water, and made for Methelage. Here, as Captain White was known to the king, they were kindly received, and stayed about a fortnight in expectation of the ship. But she not appearing, they raised their boat a streak, salted the provision the king gave them, put water aboard, and stood for the north end of the island, designing to go around, believing their ship might be at the island of St. Mary. When they came to the north end, the current, which sets to the northwest for 8 months in the year, was so strong they found it impossible to get round. Wherefore they got into a harbour, of which there are many for small vessels. Here they stayed about 3 weeks or a month, when part of the crew were for burning the boat, and travelling over land to a black king of their acquaintance, whose name was Reberimbo, who lived at a place called Manangoromazai, in latitude 15 degrees, or thereabouts. As this king had been several times assisted by whites in his wars, he was a great friend to them. Captain White dissuaded them from his undertaking, and with much ado saved the boat. But one half of the men being resolved to go by land, they took what provisions they thought necessary, and set out. Captain White, and those who stayed with him, conveyed them a day's journey, and then returning, he got into the boat with his companions, and went back to Methelage, fearing these men might return, prevail with the rest, and burn the boat. Here he built a deck on his boat, and lay by 3 months, in which time there came in 3 pirates with a boat, who had formerly been trepanned on board the Severn and Scarborough men of war, which had been looking for pirates on the east side, from which ships they made their escape at Mohila, in a small canoe to Johanna, and from Johanna to Mayotta, where the king built them the boat which brought them to Methelage. The time of the current setting with violence to the northwest being over, they proceeded together in White's boat, burning that of Mayotta, to the north end, where the current running yet too strong to get around, they went into a harbour and stayed there a month. maintaining themselves with fish and wild hogs, of which there was a great plenty. At length, having fine weather, and the strength of the current abating, they got round, and after sailing about 40 miles on the east side, they went into a harbor, where they found a piece of a jacket, which they knew belonged to one of those men who had left them to go overland. He had been a forced man and a ship carpenter. This they supposed he had torn to wrap round his feet, that part of the country being barren and rocky, as they sailed along the coast. They came to anchor in convenient harbors every night, till they got as far as Manangaromazai, where King Reberimbo resided, where they went in to inquire for the men who left them at the north end, and to recruit with provisions. The latter was given them, but they could get no information of their companions. From hence they went to the island of St. Mary, where a canoe came off to them with a letter directed to any white man. They knew it to be the hand of one of their former shipmates. The contents of this letter was to advise them to be on their guard, and not trust too much to the blacks of this place. They having been formerly treacherous, they inquired after their ship, and were informed that the company had given her to the Moors, who were gone away with her, and that they themselves were settled at Ambonovola, about 20 leagues to the southward of St. Mary, where they lived among the negroes as so many sovereign princes. One of the blacks who brought off the letter went on board their boat, carried them to the place called Ulumba, a point of land made by a river on one side, and the sea on the other, where 12 of them lived together in a large house they had built, and fortified with about 20 pieces of cannon. The rest of them were settled in small companies of about 12 or 14 together, more or less, up the said river, and along the coast, every nation by itself, as the English, French, Dutch, &c. They made inquiry of the consorts after the different prizes which belonged to them, and they found all very justly laid to be given them, if ever they returned, as were that belonged to the men who went overland. Captain White, hankering after home, proposed going out again in the boat, for he was adverse to settling with them, and many others agreed to go under his command, and if they could meet with the ship to carry them to Europe, to follow their old vacation. But the others did not think it reasonable he should have the boat, but that it should be set to sail for the benefit of the company. Accordingly it was set up, and Captain White bought it for 400 pieces of 8, and with some of his old consorts, whose number was increased by the other of the ship's crew, he went back the way he had come to Methelage. Here he met with a French ship of about 50 tons and 6 guns, which had been taken by some pirates who lived at Marathon, on the east side of the island, and some of the De Grave East Indiaman's crew, to whom the master of her refused a passage to Europe. For as he had himself been a pirate and quartermaster to Bowen in the Speaker, he apprehended their taking away his ship. War then existing between England and France, he thought they might do it without being called in question as pirates. The pirates who had been concerned in taking Herald's ship, for that was his name, had gone up the country, and left her to the men belonging to the De Grave, who had fitted her up, cleaned and tallowed her, and got in some provision, with a design to go to the East Indies, that they might light on some ship to return to their own country. Captain White, finding these men, proposed joining him, and going round to Ambonovola to make up a company. It was agreed upon, and they unanimously chose him commander. They accordingly put to sea, and stood away round the south end of the island, and touched at Don Mascarenas, where he took in a surgeon, and stretching over again to Madagascar, fell in with Ambonovola, and made up his complement of 60 men. From hence he shaped his course for the island of Mayotta, where he cleaned his ship, and waited for the season to go into the Red Sea. His provisions being taken in, the time proper, and the ship well fitted, he steered for Babo Mandeb, and running into a harbour, waited for the Mocha ships. He here took 2 grabs laden with provisions, and having some small money and drugs aboard, these he plundered of what was for his turn, kept them a fortnight by him, and let them go. Soon after they espied a lofty ship, upon which they put to sea, but finding her European built, and too strong to attempt, for it was a Dutchman, they gave over the chase, and were glad to shake them off, and returned to their station, fancying they were here discovered from the coast of Arabia, or that the Grabs had given information of them stood over the Ethiopian shore, keeping a good look out for the Mocha ships. A few days after, they met with a large ship of about 1,000 tons and 600 men, called the Malabar, which they chased, kept company with her all night, and took in the morning, with the loss of only their boatswain, and 2 or 3 men wounded. In taking the ship, they damaged their own so much by springing their foremast, carrying away their bowsprit, and beating in part of their upper works, that they did not think her longer fit for their use. They therefore filled her away with prisoners, gave them provisions, and sent them away. Some days after this they espied a Portuguese man of war of 44 guns, which they chased, but gave it over by carrying away their main topmast. so that they did not speak with her, for the Portuguese took no notice of them. 4 days after they had left this man of war, they fell in with a Portuguese merchantman, which they chased with English colours flying. The chase, taking White for an English man of war or East Indian man, made no sail to get from him, but on his coming up, bought to, and sent his boat on board with a present of sweetmeats for the English captain. His boat's crew was detained, and the pirates getting into the boat with their arms, went on board and fired on the Portuguese, who being surprised, asked if war was broke out between England and Portugal. They answered in the affirmative, but the captain could not believe them. However, they took what they liked, and kept him with them. After 2 days they met with the Dorothy, an English ship, Captain Penruddock commander, coming from Mocha. They exchanged several shots in the chase, but when they came alongside of her, they entered their men, and found no resistance. She being navigated by Moors, no Europeans, except the officers being on board. On a vote they gave Captain Penruddock, from whom they took a considerable quantity of money, the Portuguese ship and cargo, with what bail he pleased to take out of his own, bid him go about his business, and make what he could of her. As to the English ship, they kept her for their own use. Soon after they plundered the Malabar ship, out of which they took as much money as came to 200 sterling a man, but missed 50,000 sequins, which were hid in a jar under a cow's stall, kept for the giving milk to the poor supercargo and ancient man. They then put the Portuguese and more prisoners on board the Malabar, and sent them about their business. The day after they had sent them away, one Captain Benjamin Stacy and a ketch of 6 guns fell into their hands. They took what money he had, and what goods and provisions they wanted. Among the money were $500, a silver mug, and 2 spoons belonging to a couple of children on board, who were under the care of Stacy. The children took on for their loss, and the captain asked the reason of their tears, was answered by Stacy, and the above sum and plate was all the children had to bring them up. Captain White made a speech to his men, and told them it was cruel to rob the innocent children, upon which, by unanimous consent, all was restored to them again. Besides, they made a gathering among themselves, and made a present to Stacy's mate, and other of his inferior officers, and about $120 to the children. They then discharged Stacy and his crew, and made the best of their way out of the Red Sea. They came into the Bay of Dhofar, where they found a ketch at anchor, which the people had made prize of. By seizing the master and boat's crew ashore, they found a French gentleman, one Monsieur Berger, on board, whom they carried with them, took out about $2,000, and sold the ketch to the chef ashore for provisions. Hence they sailed for Madagascar, but touched at Mascarenas, where several of them went ashore with their booty, about 1,200 sterling a man. Here taking in fresh provisions, White steered for Madagascar, and fell in with Hopeful Point, where they shared their goods, and took up settlements ashore, where White built a house, bought cattle, took off the upper deck of ship, and was fitting her up for the next season. When she was near ready for sea, Captain John Halsey, who had made a broken voyage, came in with a brigantine, which being a more proper vessel for their turn, they desisted from working on the ship, and those who had a mind for fresh adventures went on board Halsey, among whom Captain White entered before the mast. At his return to Madagascar, White was taken ill of a flux, which in about 5 or 6 months ended his days. Finding his time was drawing nigh, he made his will, left several legacies, and named 3 men of different nations, guardian to a son he had by a woman in the country, requiring he might be sent to England with the money he left him, by the first English ship, to be brought up in the Christian religion, in hopes that he might live a better man than his father. He was buried with the same ceremony they used at the funerals of their companions, which is mentioned in the account of Halsey. Some years after, an English ship touching there, the guardians faithfully discharged their trust, and put him on board with the captain, who brought up the boy with care, acting by him as became a man of probity and honor. End of Life, Career, and Death of Captain Thomas White. Recording by Logan McCammon.